Hello, good afternoon, and warm welcome for this online event dedicated to the impact of migration of Russia's war against Ukraine and the presentation of the OECD assessment. I'd like to welcome our speakers. I'd like to welcome our online audience, all of you that are joining for this event. I am Etienne Bassot. I'm the director of the Members Research Service at the EPRS. The EPRS has been very active since the beginning of the year, since the invasion happened. We have organized not less than 21 events online and on-site, and we have provided a large number of publications for members of parliament that have, of course, as one can imagine, a big interest in the war, but also in the consequences on various fronts. And migration is, of course, an important consequence. That is an issue that is between what we call external policies and internal policies. I like to invite you already to, for the online audience, to use the chat function and to put your questions there, as the event will be later moderated by Kostika Dumbrava from our Citizens Policy Unit to help him to do this moderation. So for our event today, we have a lot of speakers. We have Mr. López Aguilar, which will make a couple of opening remarks. Then we have the report from the OECD that will be presented by Jean-Christophe Dumont. And then we have a roundtable discussion with Hanne BEIRENS, Yasmin Slotius, and Alberto-Horst, NEIDHARDT, and Jadwiga ROGOŞA. So just to say a few words about Mr. López Aguilar, he has been member of the European Parliament since 2009. He's chair of the LIBE committee, a very important committee in the European Parliament, very active on legislation, covering a lot of legislative files. He's also member of the Committee of Inquiry to investigate the use of Pegasus and member of the ACP EU delegation. He had several functions in Spain, Minister for Justice, member of the Spanish Parliament, and he is also active in the academic world, as he has been professor of constitutional law and published several books on comparative law, federalism and regionalism, fundamental rights and judicial systems. So the opening remarks are for Mr. López Aguilar, and I understand this is a pre-recorded message.
Good day, everybody, dear friends. I'm only sorry that I cannot make it there right with you this very day, because I am fulfilling my duties as chair of the Committee of Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, which is meeting just today, this hour. But I thank you so much for being given the chance, this opportunity to open up this event and highlight some of the relevant aspects we all see when it comes to Russia's war, Putin's war against Ukraine and in Ukraine, and the impact that it has had on the European Union migration policy so far. We now see that 9 months have passed since Russia started the war of aggression against Ukraine. We have seen since an unprecedented event in modern history of Europe. War waged in European soil, right at the external borders of the European Union. Not since the Second World War had we seen so much migration movement like today. Over 7 million, allegedly maybe even more than 10 million, have been arriving to the European Union, and well above 4 million of them have applied for protection in the European Union, according to the provisions of the Temporary Protection Directive. Well, the EU has responded. The Commission came with a proposal to activate, finally activate, the Temporary Protection Directive. We have called for it many times before, but finally we saw it in the move. We saw it in action. The decision was adopted by the Council only after a week of the war launched by Putin against Ukraine late February this year. From the European Parliament, this European Parliament, we have many times asked for the temporary protection to be used in the Syrian civil war, in the Afghan Taliban comeback to power, but the last time following the migration situation in 2015 and 16, the fact that the Temporary Protection Directive has been finally activated for the first time since it was adopted in 2001 to enable a framework for the refugees arriving is a positive thing, and we celebrate it. Not only has the EU acted, also civil society, individual citizens, local entities, regional organizations, and sure, also governments and authorities. I'm still impressed, actually humbled, by the humanitarian kind of response that we saw from individual citizens and NGOs, organizations of all kinds in the external borders of the European Union particularly. All over Europe, people have been opening up their homes to provide comfort to those fleeing this senseless war. From the Committee of Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, we call it LIBE Committee, we have regularly followed up the implementation of the Temporary Protection Directive. We are aware that not everything that we have seen so far perfect, for sure, but we support the Commission's guidelines for as an extensive interpretation of the directive as possible. We know that there are different views on Ukrainian citizens and third country nationals, stateless persons, with either permanent or temporary residence permanents in Ukraine between member states. Even for family members of Ukrainian citizens, coordination and a structured response is key to guarantee that people are not left behind or lacking the necessary support, and to protect especially women and children from being exploited by criminal elements, both labor exploitation, let alone sexual exploitation. We've got to make sure we do our best to prevent that from happening in a coordinated fashion. In September, I myself, as chair of the LIBE Committee, chaired a mission to the borders of Ukraine, both Poland and Romania. We met with government representatives, national authorities, local authorities, border guards, regional and local representatives, international and local organizations, visited reception centers. At the time, the situations were rather calm, but it was still impressive to talk and listen to the stories we were told. One of the questions we frequently asked were contingency planning and being prepared for the winter, the so-called general winter, which is already on its way. We are now at the doorway of the winter time, and we have seen that Russia has done its best to destroy necessary infrastructures for the civilians. When it gets even colder and temporary fixes will not be enough, I truly believe we need to be ready for further movements towards us, and we need to prepare for taking them in. It is hence of crucial importance that we can ensure the reception of persons, especially taking into account the situation of children, minors and accompanied minors, for which childcare, schooling and protection needs to be the highest priority. Of course, something like this cannot go unnoticed in other areas when discussing migration, and especially discussing the new pact on migration and asylum, the reform of the common European asylum system, consisting of 5 regulations which are now well underway in the legislative procedure we're working on here in the LIBE Committee and the European Parliament. We know that the French presidency during the spring was able to unlock some of the blockages within the Council of the whole discussion. After some months under the French presidency, the European Parliament and the French presidency, with the remaining 4 presidencies left during this mandate, during this legislature, including the current Czech presidency, the forthcoming Swedish, then the Spaniard, and finally the Belgian presidency, signed a roadmap in September. This roadmap sets clear obligations for both the presidencies and the European Parliament to work on the files with the new pact on migration and asylum and the new common European asylum system reform. As a rapporteur myself for the crisis regulation, I, together with the negotiating team, have worked intensely during the autumn in order to get a mandate from the European Parliament so that we can start trilogue discussions with the Council as soon as possible and make it happen before the end of this term of the European Parliament and the Commission, before June 2024. I am also aware that the efforts of other rapporteurs for the concerned files, and I do believe we will be ready to start negotiations, engaging in negotiations, active negotiations with the Council soon enough. We know that the current Czech presidency has made progress on the discussion on the Asylum Migration Management Regulation, the RAM regulation we call it. We hope that the forthcoming Swedish presidency will also be able to transfer those general agreements into the legislative text so that we can also start to negotiate the whole package in the final track. As for us, from the European Parliament, you know that we have sustained what we call a package approach. And of course, the solidarity parts are essential. Asylum and Migration Management Regulation and Crisis Regulation are the solidarity pillar, crucial in order to strike the right balance in this package approach and make it right. Of course, I know it's difficult to know the impact of the war in Ukraine, but our opinion is that it'll surely have a major impact in every possible field of action for the European Union in the foreseeable future. I think many member states have been able to internally unblock some of the migration-related obstacles and to actually see what are the capacities within the member states and the Union. In 2015, it was impossible for us to receive 1 million refugees. But now we see that we have actually delivered. We have stood up to the challenge, and we have actually made the right choice, making it possible to host many more, up to 7, maybe more, 10 million people fleeing the war in Ukraine. And sure, we cannot forget the problems that still exist at our borders and the fact that search and rescue ships containing migrants are an essential matter. It is not acceptable that they are refused to enter certain ports in violation of the safe disembarkation clauses of the international law of the seas that was codified in Montego Bay 1982. That only stresses the need to move forward with it, reform and create a system that can both handle large-scale war at our borders, but also cope with migration and asylum seekers, due respect to their fundamental rights involved, arriving to any parts of our external borders. That is why I can only wish you a fruitful discussion during this afternoon, and I thank you for your attention. All the best. See you soon.
So we are thankful to Mr. López Aguilar for his introduction, and he has actually covered a lot of ground. I noted, of course, the presentation of his political perspective on how the response should be, the work of the Libe Committee and the Parliament in the legislative work. I noted also the solidarity by the people that was quite central to the response. And of course, the particular attention that needs to be devoted to exploitation of the most vulnerable, namely children and women. He referred also to the upcoming winter and the contingency planning, and the need to find very concrete answer on the ground. And I'd like to mention here this initiative that was launched recently and for which our president has been very much advocating, namely Generators for Hope for Ukraine. And finally, I'd like also to note that we are, of course, focusing on this migration issue on Ukraine, but there are other points of tension, and Mediterranean and the Channel are other entry points in the EU, and we see that the recent actuality has shown that this should not be forgotten. I stop here and I will hand the micro to Jean-Christophe Dumont. He will introduce the International Migration Outlook 2022 by the OECD. He's head of the International Migration Division within the OECD, and that's part of the Directorate for Employment, Labour and Social Affairs. And I like to use this occasion to praise the excellent relation that EPRS has with OECD on various fronts since many years. We have been working together. So many thanks for being with us today, Jean-Christophe, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the kind invitation from the European Parliament Research Service to present some of the findings of the International Migration Outlook 2022. There is a special chapter in that report that looks at the implication of a war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. There is obviously much more in this report, and I would encourage everyone to take a look because I think there are in particular very interesting findings on other topics like international students. But let me now focus in this presentation that I will share with you. So yes, I would like to share some of the findings, but also more generally some of the work of the OECD on the consequences of a war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. Just for those of you who don't necessarily know the OECD, it offers a forum for exchanges on policies between countries, both at working level and at political level. And in the context of a war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, we have very quickly organized a number of events, notably at ministerial level, to discuss these issues. We have also produced a large number of policy briefs. You have a selection of them on this slide, analyzing a broad range of substantive issues in close cooperation, notably with the European Migration Network, but also with the European Asylum Agency, and in particular, recently, we have produced a joint EUA, IOM, OECD report on forced displacement from and within Ukraine, which is mentioned here. So I will try to cover some of this ground on communication, housing, financial impact, labor market impact, education, labor market inclusion in my presentation today. So first of all, yes, the numbers, they've been reminded by López Aguilar in his opening remarks. Indeed, these numbers are historical high. Not only they are record high, but they also happen in a very short period of time. In September, we counted about 4 million people registered as beneficiary of temporary protection. In November, this number has reached 4.7 million. Even if one takes into account possible double counts and returns to Ukraine, they would still be in the EU more than 4 million beneficiaries of temporary protection. The main receiving countries are, as you can see on this graph, Poland and Germany, Czech Republic as a third country. But in relative terms, we should not forget that this is mostly the Baltic countries, Estonia #1 with Czech Republic, followed by Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, who are receiving the larger share of Ukrainian refugees as a percentage of their population. We should not also forget either that a number of people who have reached the EU in the first place have, after that, applied to move on to some other OECD countries. And if I look at the number of applications to the UK, almost 250,000, to the US, about 150,000, to Canada, almost 700,000 applications. The total reached over 1 million people who have applied to move on from the EU to these countries. In total, more than 400,000 people have already arrived in these three countries, to which we should add at least 50,000 in Israel. So the numbers are also very high outside the EU in some OECD countries. It's well known that this large inflow of refugees have very specific characteristics, socio-demographic characteristics, and notably the fact that it's mostly composed of women and children. We have collected the data for 14 countries on this slide that shows that between 70 to 80% of the adults are indeed women, but between 30 to 40% are children below age 18. What you can see here is that in countries neighboring Ukraine, but most notably in Poland, the share of women and children tend to be higher than in countries which are a bit further away, like Spain or Sweden in this graph. The other key characteristics of the refugee from Ukraine is that they are, to a large extent, highly educated. There's still a lot of uncertainty about to which extent this is the case, but this graph is showing the results from the online survey that EUA and OECD have organized, and it clearly shows that more than 60% declare to have a tertiary diploma. And when we look at the region of origin in Ukraine, about more than 85% of those coming from the Kyiv region have a tertiary diploma. As I said, there is a lot of uncertainty on these numbers, but it's very clear that people are more educated than other refugee groups. They are also more educated than the general population in Ukraine, and in some cases, they are also more educated than the native-born population of your country. Here you have some more precise number, which comes from administrative data or surveys that the country have organized. And as you can see, among those who arrived in the UK in June, more than 81% declared to have a tertiary diploma. In Ireland, it's 70%. In Spain, it's 61%. And this is fairly consistent across the board. A lower level in Poland, this is coming from a report from the Polish Central Bank, but yet still much higher than any other refugee group in the EU. Certainly, as Mr. Lopez Aguilar said, it's very satisfactory to see the extent to which all OECD countries have very, very swiftly and efficiently responded to this crisis by activating the temporary protection directive for as far as EU countries are concerned. But it's also fair to say that for other European countries, those who are not covered by the temporary protection directive, I'm thinking about Denmark, I'm thinking Norway, Switzerland, I'm also thinking about the UK, and outside Europe, about Canada, Australia, United States, Israel, they all have very quickly put in place a legal framework to enable people to stay, those were Ukrainians were in the country, for new people to come, but also to facilitate their access to the labor market and integration in this country through temporary protection schemes. Canada, for example, didn't have such a scheme before and developed it just in the context of the Ukrainian crisis very, very quickly. It's also fair to say that, and very satisfactory to see that some of the lessons learned from previous crises have been taken into account in the context of this large inflow of refugees. We've seen notably very quickly the activation of the integrated crisis response mechanism in the EU, which has led now to the blueprint and to some other exchange of information, automatic exchange of information between member states. The coordination in the response is really to a high degree. There has been also some channel of consultation and collaboration between different levels of governments in most countries, between the government and the non-governmental organization, the civil society. Across the board, it's clear that a number of lessons learned from previous crises have been have been taken into account. The other element is obviously that a lot of investment has been made since 2015-16 on integration infrastructure or policies in a number of EU countries, and it's also true that the response has been able to take advantage of these investments to better accommodate and improve reception facilities for Ukrainian refugees. And last but not least, I think, as Mr. Lopez Aguilar said, we should obviously mention the outstanding involvement of the host communities, of EU citizens in general, offering their homes and responding very, very efficiently with a big heart to the people coming up. So all that together has led. It's true. So both the specific socio-demographic characteristics of the recently arrived refugee from Ukraine and the policy response to much better short-term outcomes in terms of labor market inclusion. Here we have put together numbers for about 11 countries in the EU in terms of employment. I must say this is a very difficult exercise because of a number of challenges here. We cannot use labor force survey to get to these numbers. The sample size and sample design of a labor force survey would not allow to cover Ukrainian population at this stage. So unless there are some specific surveys like in the United Kingdom, we have to rely on administrative data to identify the number of people who are employed. Sometimes this is based on notification from employers that risk double counting. Sometimes it's based on social security registration, which risk undercounting if not everyone who is working is necessarily registered in the social security system, as in Germany. And on the top of that, there is some uncertainty, as I said before, about the denominators of a number of people who are still in the country. We don't always have detailed age, and we don't always monitor properly returns. But all in all, what this number shows is that the labor market inclusion of Ukrainian refugees has been much, much more rapid than for any other refugee group in the EU. The 2014 data from EU LFS shown that it took about 5 to 10 years for half of the people to be in employment. We have reached in a number of countries this level in 9 months. This is a very positive sign, and which shows again the result of the policies, but also the willingness of people to integrate or work, I must say, quickly in European destination countries. Altogether, we have estimated at the OECD that the number of Ukrainians that could enter the EU labor market by the end of this year would be close to 1.2 million, a bit less than 1 million in terms of number of people employed. This is twice as a percentage of the EU population compared to what was observed during the whole period 2014 to 2017 in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis. But yet this is only 0.5% of the EU population. So just to say it very quickly, this inflow of people in the EU labor market will not solve the looming labor shortages that we have observed in the post-COVID recovery period. We've seen some recruitment difficulties in a number of sectors and occupations across Europe, and we should not assume that the inflow of Ukrainian refugee will solve that. Second, it's certainly not an argument either in terms of destabilizing the equilibrium of the labor market. It will not affect wages. It will not affect unemployment. These are large numbers, but that are absolutely absorbable by the EU labor market as a whole. Obviously, some countries are in the front line. We mentioned Czech Republic. We expect that the inflow of refugees may account for up to 2.2% of their labor force. Poland, 2%. Estonia, 1.9% in this country. The effect might be a little bit bigger, but yet, again, very manageable for the EU labor market as a whole. Let me say a few words about the outlook and what might be the upcoming issues. As I said, the short-term outcomes in terms of labor market inclusion are very positive, but countries are now increasingly focusing also on medium and longer-term outcomes. This has to do with mainstreaming support, so access to general social security system, to access to mainstream integration services, language courses, recognition of foreign qualification, and so on and so forth, except in a few countries, such as Sweden and France, for example, where there's still some specific provision for Ukrainians. But there is also a number of challenges in the school system that we should not underestimate. About 700,000 people have been integrated in training and education system of the EU countries. But still, a large number of Ukrainian children are still following distance learning in Ukrainian language in some countries. I will come back to that in a minute. And despite the quick labor market integration, what we also see is that there is a lot of overqualification among these people. As I said, a large share of them are tertiary educated. Most of them don't work in their area of qualification. In Spain, for example, but this is, similar numbers for Austria, Bulgaria, Denmark, Switzerland, Ireland. 30% are working in hospitality, 10% working in construction, as I said. That's not necessarily the areas or the sectors in which they were working before. In Latvia, we know that 40% of people are working in the elementary occupation. In the UK, more than 2/3 of people, as I said, very high, 55% of people employed, but 2/3 of them are working in a different occupational sector than the one in which they were working in Ukraine. And therefore, here we have an issue which is about how to move forward this first step in the labor market to something which is really fully taking into account the skills that people have in reality. It's fair to say that a number of things are happening. Host countries began to expand some services. Notably, we have a number of programs in terms of support for job search and implication of public employment services in most EU countries. I must say this is much clearer than for other refugee groups or other migrant groups in many cases. There are online matching platforms which are specific for Ukrainian, not to mention the EU talent pool for Ukraine, but also in Canada, in Estonia, in Poland, a very interesting experiment in Germany, in Portugal. There are a number of steps which have been taken by country to already try to address the issue I just mentioned in terms of the mismatch between the skills and the employment. Certainly, the EU skills profile tool has been adapted to the Ukrainian language, but we've seen a number of initiatives in Germany, in particular some other countries as well, Portugal, to facilitate recognition of foreign qualification. Some examples are mentioned there: automatic recognition for some occupation in Norway, measures to deal with missing documents, Czech Republic, Austria, and a number of other waivers and actions that have been taken by member states, really trying to address some of these medium and longer term issues I've identified before. let me go back very quickly to this very important question of the enrollment of Ukrainian children in the school system. This obviously is key to enable their mothers to integrate the labor market. This has been identified as a potential bottleneck very early in the process in most countries. And indeed, from this number, again, that we have compiled based on our estimation of a number of minors in these different countries and what we know about the enrollment rate in nursery, primary, and secondary education, you can see that with some exceptions, notably a lower enrollment rate in some of the neighboring countries, a large share of children seems already to be enrolled in the education system. Integration of children in the education system is very important, not only for their mothers, it's also very important for themselves because it enables them to socialize with host communities, to create links, to learn the language. But what we see is obviously that also due to a large offer from the Ukrainian side in terms of distance learning, notably through the website All Ukrainians Online School, which goes from grade 5 to 11, but also the NUMO online kindergarten developed between Ukraine and UNICEF. There is a large offer of for children to maintain schooling online. It's certainly positive due to the challenges to integrate some of the children in the normal school system, but it's a challenge if the situation has to remain for quite some time. There are a number of other challenges which may be due to secondary movements, to the fact that housing, temporary housing may imply for people to move to different locations to secure more permanent housing, and continuity of the school system might be an issue. There is question around mutual recognition of the education system, and here I would like to emphasize the very good practice that Ukraine has set up with 5 EU countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Czech Republic, where they have in principle recognition of the education system in these 5 countries, meaning that the children, Ukrainian children who are following education in this education system will be automatically recognized at the equivalent level in Ukrainian system, facilitating in a way this mobility. But I think that remains a big challenge going forward. The other challenge is certainly about housing. Access to self-secure and affordable housing is a precondition for refugees to restore stability in their life and connect with the host community. The rapid influx happen in the context of a significant pre-existing housing challenge, such as insufficient housing supply and rising costs, limited option. Certainly now that we also expect, as Mr. Lopez-Aguilar mentioned, further inflows as a result of the consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine during the winter period. We need to step up the effort on this. Temporary facilities are needed to house further possible inflows. We've seen some initiative in Poland where they have developed container houses, but we know that in a number of countries, the occupancy rate in government-provided facilities is already very high, between 60 to 80%. And in some countries, some mentioned here, Belgium, Ireland, Latvia, Netherlands, Portugal, the capacity has been exhausted already. So here we are facing a real challenge going forward. The last point I want to mention before I close with some questions for the discussion is about a new concept that is gaining a lot of importance for two reasons. This is the dual intent integration principle. So facilitating the short-term integration of Ukrainian refugees while not necessarily affecting the probability that they return to Ukraine. This is a new concept for integration policies that stem from the fact that indeed people have temporary protection. In a number of countries, they are not expected to stay forever, even if we know that a large share of them will stay. But also the Ukrainian government is very keen to get Ukrainian citizens back in Ukraine when things stabilize to participate to the recovery of the country. So here we're looking at policies which will facilitate the swift labor market entry, enabling people to rebuild their life now, but also will not affect their probability to return. I mentioned this initiative between Ukraine and 5 European countries regarding mutual recognition of the education system, which is exactly in that spirit. We need more of this initiative on the labor market side. There might be some ideas to support that principle, but how can we build dual intent integration system is a new concept that EU countries have to think about, but I would say also US and Canada, which are also providing only temporary protection at this stage. So key questions, moving ahead, a number of them very quickly. Should we expect further large-scale arrival of Ukrainian refugees? And if yes, will the profile be similar? Will they go to the same country? We don't know about that. And obviously, this is very important in terms of adapting the policy response. What is the scope, current scope of secondary movements within the EU and to other OECD countries? I've mentioned already 1 million people have applied to go to Canada, Australia, UK, and the United States. These are not small numbers, but also how could we better monitor returns to Ukraine? This is a big challenge in the monitoring system, a big loophole, I would say, in the monitoring system right now. Third, should integration policy adapt to early signals of change and likelihood to return? And if so, how? How can we cooperate better with Ukraine to develop truly dual intent policy, and what this policy may look like? I gave some ideas, but I think this is really a new question for Europe. What policies are needed to address the question of cross-border mobility and remote work? Maybe a solution to the previous question here. Looking a little bit more ahead, how can we anticipate the phasing out of the temporary protection directive? What are the transitions that are necessary between this protection regime and maybe some more regular residency permit, keeping in mind also the other question on dual intent I mentioned before? I think this is a question that we should ask ourselves sooner rather than later, because it might not be so easy to adapt. And maybe the last question, which I think is really important, which is, as I said, the response to Ukraine has built on the lessons learned from the previous crisis. We've seen a very efficient response here, very successful in terms of early labor market inclusion, not minimizing the remaining challenges, obviously. But what can we learn for integration of other refugee groups or migrants in general? I think, for example, the involvement, very strong involvement of public employment services, which was not common practice in a number of EU countries, should lead us to some reflection about how we can learn to also improve the quick and successful labor market, but also societal inclusion of all migrants coming to the EU, which remains a big challenge. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, for giving such an extensive presentation of the report. We noted that there are a lot of data and facts included there, and I encourage those who have not read it yet or who don't have it yet on their desk to take it and to read it and to use it also in the everyday work, as this data can be used various levels in our daily work, engaging with the public and also working on legislations and policy responses. Many thanks for all that. And that brings me now to the second part of that event, which is the panel discussion. And the panel discussion is going to be moderated by Kostika Dumbrava. Kostika works with us since several years. He has also worked previously in the Commission. In the Citizens Policy Unit, he is responsible for fight against terrorism, management of external and internal borders, Schengen governance, Frontex, free movement of EU citizens. So thank you very much, Kostika, and over to you to introduce our panelists and lead the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Etienne. And thank you, Jean-Christophe, indeed, for such a wonderful presentation. You managed to put so much in so little time, and gave us a wealth of information and excellent questions, by the way. If we managed to answer a couple of those questions that you put in the end, then we did a good job today. Just to remind the audience that we do have the chat, so please don't be shy. Fire your questions, what Jean-Christophe presentation or during the discussion of the panelists. We'll be happy to collect them and give them to the speakers. We have three panelists now, including a surprise one. Thank you, Yasmin, for stepping in such a short notice. So I propose that we listen to them in a short succession and then leave room for an open discussion and also for the questions from the audience. So without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce you Yasmin Sloches, who is a senior policy analyst of the Migration Policy Institute in Brussels. She's working mainly on issues of immigrant integration. She has also worked before as a director of the Berkeley Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative at the University of California, Berkeley. And she has a PhD in sociology on migration studies from the University of Amsterdam. So Yasmin, your floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kostika. And first of all, also thank you to Jean-Christophe DUMONT and the OECD team for this excellent report. In my conversations during the unfolding of this crisis, a lot of the questions and comments that I received was how difficult it is to develop effective approaches in times of uncertainty. And it feels sometimes like driving in the dark. And it's a report like this that kind of helps to shed light on the road ahead and kind of help us map the road ahead. So I think this is, of course, is very welcome. And so thank you for posing these very interesting questions, especially about dual intent integration. I think I'd love to touch upon that more. In my response, I'd like to touch upon two much broader themes and then dive also a little bit deeper on one thematic area of labor market integration. And yeah, my first point will be about reflecting on building more resilient and emergency-proof integration systems and reflecting on how the Temporary Protection Directive has impacted the integration and also the policy development context. And I think this is very clear from the OECD Migration Outlook. If you look at the report, we all know how, and we're all very happy with the unanimous adoption of the Temporary Protection Directive, yet how this plays out in different member states varies very significantly. So we may see the legal right to access healthcare, but this actually only covers emergency healthcare, which is just a basic human right that also irregular migrants have. But the actual access to healthcare and the supports and the different measures that are taken to overcome barriers to accessing healthcare vary significantly across member states in the European Union and often also across regions. So just some examples that are also mentioned in the report that, for example, in Sweden, children do receive full access but adults do not to healthcare, and that, for example, in Belgium or Portugal, there's additional access to mental health care through hotlines. But yeah, what it looks like, access to healthcare depends very much in which country you are. And this is with every policy area. So if you talk about education, or if you talk about access to the labor market, so is there a matching platform? Is there any support? Is there any guidance on how to navigate the labor market? So this is something to reflect on, this very differential reality on the ground, and how this impacts integration trajectories. And I think a report like this, as the OECD, mapping out these differences, will help us to do these analysis, and also for policymakers to reflect on how they could tweak their existing measures and policies. Another difference, and it's a little bit related still to the temporary protection status, is that it's a different status, and it displays out differently in how you have access to mainstream integration programs across countries. So, for example, in a country like Austria, having temporary protection status means that you have automatic access to mainstream integration programs. But in Sweden, this was not the case, for example. So these are just examples, and this really shifts your integration trajectory. And this is then, of course, the supply side. Do you have access to what is available to you? But there's also, of course, a demand side. So what are the decisions by those that are displaced themselves? Do they decide to enter an integration program? And we've reflected on this, and I think these questions were already posed before, is the high level of uncertainty that we're facing. There's a lot of uncertainty on the end of policymakers, member states, service providers. Will these people, or will people stay? How long? And which groups will stay? So is there a certain specific demographic profile or subgroup that will leave? Will this vary across different member states? And how much money and funding are you then willing to allocate and invest in long-term integration when this is not a given? I think there's multiple polls out there and data that shows that a significant number, and I saw a poll from Poland that was about a third of those displaced from Ukraine are planning to stay more long-term. But these numbers, right, it's still uncertain. So this really complicates the policy-making challenge. And in addition to that, of course, the demand side, if you are not sure if you're staying long-term, are you then willing to invest a lot of time in an integration course, which may leave you with lost earnings if instead you could be working? So here, I think this dual intent integration is very important. And another term that came to my mind was integration light. And kind of a reflection, how can we match different integrations services to tackle this particular situation, and at the same time learn from the approaches that we are setting up right now to inform more effective integration policies also for other groups and moving forward, so we're ready for the next challenge. And some of these measures that you could think about are more modular approaches, more flexible hours, of course, leveraging digital learning. We've invested a lot across many member states into moving integration and language programs online during the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, there are some limitations there, but this does provide some opportunities here. And of course, more vocation-specific training. So there's more targeted language learning based on the job sector that you're planning to work on. To shift my contribution a little bit in a different direction, and I think it was already touched upon in the previous presentations. That's great. So I'll keep it a little bit short, but it's not only about the actual measures, but also how these measures are implemented, the governance and the collaboration across different stakeholders that facilitate this integration. And we really see an acceleration of an ongoing trend of increasingly more multi-stakeholder collaboration across levels of governance, so an increased role for frontline cities, and also direct collaboration with EU and international organizations of cities, but also with non-governmental actors. And this is absolutely key. And what we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic was that states that had a structural collaboration or coordination network within their country, for example, Portugal, with civil society organizations, migrant group representatives, different policy areas, local level, national level, all reflected, they could hit the ground running. They can coordinate in times of crisis. So it's very important to invest in these sustainable coordination and collaboration platforms. And there's one small anecdote that I want to share that I think is quite interesting here and a little bit highlights, I think, also the potential. Sometimes I like to look at the silver lining of a crisis. So, for example, in Hungary, we see that this crisis also defies sometimes political opposition. So in Hungary, you have the Association for Migrants. It's a civil society organization that does not necessarily see eye to eye with the national government in Hungary. But they've been collaborating officially in the response to welcome people displaced from Ukraine. So I think this is really promising. And I think there's a lot of this increase in collaboration. I would also like to make two very small points about labor market integration. It was already mentioned, it's very quick, yet it's also about low-skilled and temporary roles. And we have to reflect on this. We are facing currently labor shortages, but at the same time, we hear a lot of reflection on impending economic downturn. And the people with temporary contracts and low-skilled jobs, they will probably be the first to lose their jobs. So what does that mean for long-term labor market integration for these groups? And there's an excellent commentary by my colleagues Kate Hooper and Maria Vincenza Desiderio on the MPI Europe website if you're interested. So to close my my contribution with a quote, it's been repeated a lot, but I will be one of them who does that again, from Ursula von der Leyen. Our action towards Ukrainian refugees must not be an exception. They can be our blueprint for going forward. There's a lot of reflection, of course, on the unique situation. But I think what is crucial about this is reflect on what we can learn from the current crisis. What can we replicate moving forward and build more resilient, more effective and sustainable migration and integration systems, including and investing these collaboration and coordination networks that really involve non-governmental actors and really reflect the crucial role that cities and the local level play. And I look very much forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin, for the wonderful contribution. I note down the word uncertainty, indeed uncertainty, on also the policy level, what policymaker will do, but also the level of migrants themselves, people who do not know they return or they stay for longer. So the best policy making, I think the best policies are indeed those who take into account these uncertainties and build for the future, emergency proof, as you said. Now, I will give immediately the floor to our second speaker, is Jadwiga ROGOŞA, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw. She is expert on Ukraine and Russia, commenting and following up developments in the region. She has also been a diplomat for the Polish embassy in Moscow between 2015 and 2018. So I hope we'll get some excellent insight from that experience as well. So Jadwiga, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Let me start. I'm really honored to speak with my distinguished co-speakers. Thank you for the presentations. And my input is presenting some factors concerning the living conditions in Ukraine. That I consider push factors for immigration, but also some factors that show the resilience of Ukrainian society. My first constatation is that, speaking of uncertainty, this war is likely to last, so we have a long-term problem. And so far, the damage caused by the war has been disastrous. And we can say that Ukraine is devastated. Its economy, its energy system, its infrastructure, and it's getting worse every day. In September, material losses related to only infrastructure damage were calculated at $130 billion, and this is increasing every day. And Ukrainian Ministry of Territorial Development counted that almost 2.5 million people lost their homes, which are ruined. So this is more or less the scale. And we also see that when Russia withdraws from some territories, like the newly deoccupied Kherson, it is leaving them devastated, plundered, with environmental disasters, with destroyed critical infrastructure. So there are practically no conditions to stay there. So people have to leave those territories. A very acute factor is at the moment are massive rocket attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure. And they haven't started last week. They are ongoing since early October. But the largest attack took place on November 23rd, and it caused the failure of Ukraine's entire energy system, damaged most of heat and power plants, and all working nuclear plants had to be stopped, rail transport stopped, many residential buildings and healthcare facilities were destroyed. These are all the factors that severely affect the living conditions. And as a result, millions of Ukrainians still live without or with only limited supplies of electricity, water. It's usual to have energy for 2 or 3 hours a day. And it very much depends on the city, on the place. Another thing, Ukraine's healthcare system is in total crisis. It suffered more than 700 attacks. Now it's suffering from energy crisis. And coming winter season is a very acute factor as well, because temperatures will be dropping. In Ukraine in winter, temperatures are on average -5, -10%, but they can drop to -20, so it depends on this winter season. Another factor affecting the number of IDPs or refugees is the need to evacuate people from deoccupied regions, like the one I mentioned, Kherson region, because living conditions are disastrous. And already we have a wave of IDPs moving to other Ukrainian cities. And it also depends how well other regions will be prepared to receive them. Another factor is psychological condition of Ukrainians, and which is serious, because according to World Health Organization, about 10 million of Ukrainians suffer from various mental disorders, from acute stress, from anxiety, from depression, from PTSD syndrome. And to close this part, obviously the situation on the front and further course of fights is a major factor, and Western aid as well. And at the moment, the key item for Ukraine are electricity generators. But even more so, these are air defense systems, because they could prevent the destruction of critical infrastructure. So notably that the recent NATO summit in Bucharest discussed the delivery of Patriot air defense system to Ukraine. As a result, there are predictions of refugees and IDPs, and the WHO predicts that from 2 to 3 million people may leave their homes in search of warmth and safety. Having said that, I want to stress that for the last 2 weeks, we've been monitoring the number of border crossings with Poland, and there is not an indication of a significant growth of people crossing the border. It's more or less 20,000 crossings in both directions. So we don't see a big wave as yet. A factor that has to be mentioned here is the resilience of Ukrainian society. And we can see that hardships do not automatically translate into the willingness to leave the country or make some concessions to Russia. On the other hand, on the contrary, the society shows determination to continue the armed struggle against Russia. And in October, there was a public opinion poll in October when rocket attacks were already massive, and 86% of Ukrainians said that they were in favor of continuing the armed struggle. So we can see that it's not a factor inclining people to leave the country. And the second thing is people show really remarkable capabilities to adapt to those conditions which seem disastrous. They show solidarity, creativity in various spheres, how to save power now, how to help each other. And as we can judge, most of those who wanted to leave the country have already done that. And those who remain, they are either able to adapt and be very creative about it, or they have no potency, no resources to leave the country. These are often elderly people, people with depression. So even if living conditions are very bad, they cannot leave the country or even the place of their stay. And if those people get sufficient help, they would rather stay in Ukraine. And let me end my presentation with an anecdote, like Yasmin shared with us some story. I just heard the relation from a woman who had to leave the Kherson region because it's impossible to stay there. She moved to Odessa, and Odessa also suffered from electricity shortage. But this woman said that compared to life under Russian occupation, this is nothing serious. And they are really determined to bear it and to stay in Ukraine. So I think all these factors can be considered. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jadwiga. This is sort of picture of what's happening in Ukraine there. I take from you the resilience as something that we learned from the Ukrainian people during this time. And also, indeed, the fact that there are all kind of predictions about the future migration waves, but it is again uncertain. And as you can see, the crossing across the border are really in both ways, despite this situation in the country. So that will not help us with predicting on adapting more policies, more clear data, for example. So without further delay, our last but not least speaker is Alberto-Horst NEIDHARDT. He is a policy analyst in the European Policy Center in Brussels. He does research on migration, asylum, and integration issues. And is also teaching comparative law and legal pluralism at the University of Antwerp. And he has a PhD in comparative European international law from the European University Institute. He'll talk about more about integration and directive temporary protection. So Alberto, your floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here. I also want to congratulate the OECD for this year's Outlook. It's an inspiring reading, and it really helps a variety of actors, I think, in the field with crucial data and analysis. I have a difficult task ahead, providing some further reflections after 3 great presentations without boring you. So I'll do my best, and I'll try to do this holistically. I look at the past, the present, and the future prospects relating to displacement from Ukraine to Europe. And in the process, I will also try to engage with some of the questions which have been raised until now. Starting with the past then, I believe that it's necessary to spend a few words on the unanimous decision by member states to activate the TPD on 4 March. This was 7 days after the invasion by Russia, as also highlighted by Mr. López Aguilar. By contrast, for 7 years, since 2015, member states have been unable to agree to a wider package of reforms, which has exacerbated problems of the European common asylum system. And one point to highlight in this context, as it is also connected to the question on secondary movements raised before, is that under the TPD, member states would normally have to take back beneficiaries of temporary protection who moved to a country different from that where they first applied for protection. But when activating the TPD, member states decided to forego these prerogatives. And considering that Ukrainians already enjoy visa-free travel across the EU. This means that Ukrainian refugees have been able to benefit from their rights and entitlements in any EU state where they applied for it, having the possibility of making multiple subsequent applications. And I think this says a lot about the capacity to reach consensus in a short period of time, also on sensitive issues. But we also need to look into the circumstances of why member states agreed to these. And the activation of the TPD was both to offer security of status and immediate protection to displaced persons, but also clearly to preserve a fragile EU asylum system and bypass divisive debates on responsibility sharing and relocations. Now, moving to the present, extraordinary measures have been clearly put in place, but the activation of the TPD was just the beginning, as the previous presentations have shown. We have also seen very encouraging signs when it comes to labor inclusion in comparison to other refugee groups, as Mr. DUMONT has pointed out. That said, it's clear that there are challenges which have been recorded in all key areas: access to education, housing, labor integration. And I will not repeat what has been said already very eloquently by previous speakers. What I want to emphasize, however, is one aspect in particular, which is that we shouldn't examine these various fields, education, labor integration, and housing, in isolation. These are clearly interconnected. The lack of available places in school can significantly hinder access to the labor market by refugees, particularly if they are primary carers, as in the case of many displaced Ukrainians, and this was mentioned already. But evidently also limited housing opportunities can entail longer commuting distances, or can more in general reduce employment prospects for Ukrainian refugees. Again, durable housing solutions will have an impact on the ability of refugees' access to social protections, or their capacity to benefit from longer-term integration resources. Lack of a permanent address is also a barrier in accessing documentation and registration for certain services, and so on and so forth. So this is, I think it's important that challenges that remain and challenges which will arise in the future will be dealt with holistically. And I think this is especially urgent, considering that if these challenges have not been addressed or will not be addressed in the short term, these will have a deep impact on the longer term inclusion prospects. Which brings me to the third part of this short presentation. When it comes to future scenarios, I think that it's necessary to look at two timescales, this winter and the possibility of further arrivals, which has already been commented on, and the longer term potential post-war scenarios. Now, to begin with the more immediate future prospects, Ukrainian nationals, the statistics show, are coming to Europe in greater numbers than those who return to Ukraine. And this is statistics from the months of October and November. What this is showing is that there is a reversal of a consolidated trend which was ongoing since last June, since the summer. This is caused, among others, by the approaching winter and by the recent attacks on the infrastructure, as Jadwiga has already pointed out. And from this viewpoint, the extension of temporary protection for an additional year is a necessary step, but I think it's just the beginning of a longer process. And from my viewpoint, there is a need for better preparedness on the one hand, but also there is a need to switch to streamlining as much as possible integration measures. As to the former, better preparedness, member states, in my view, have to strengthen the resilience of their reception systems in the face of probable new arrivals. And the European Commission should deliver the common European contingency and response plan that it had committed to devise back in March. And since then, I believe, has been in preparation. At the same time, there is a need for a more durable solution, particularly access to safe and affordable housing solutions. But as has already been mentioned, over the winter, more arrivals over the winter will pose additional challenges in a context where reception systems of many European countries are already overstretched. not only in countries neighboring Ukraine, but also further to the west. And commenting again on uncertainty, as others before have done, these lack of housing solutions clearly create a lot of uncertainties for Ukrainians too, because simply put, many don't know where they will be sleeping after 4th of March, which is a big uncertainty. Now, this brings me to the last point, the longer term scenarios. I think the IMO has emphasized that temporary protection is based on the expectation of an eventual return to the country. But numerous studies have shown that Ukrainian refugees are currently unable to make secure longer-term plans in the current context. And this is a really sensitive issue, and I'm glad that Mr. DUMONT has raised it. I believe that we need to address the issue around return very cautiously. In my mind, the Ukrainian government has understandably put pressure on its partners so as to ensure that Ukrainians can eventually go back. Why is this understandable? Well, just looking at the numbers of persons who are currently abroad, before the Russian invasion, the population of Ukraine was estimated to be around 38 million, I believe. And UNHCR estimates that there are now close to 8 million persons living just in Europe, which constitutes 20% of the Ukrainian population, with most among them being women and children. So as the report also notes, the return and reintegration of these Ukrainian nationals is understandably seen as vital for rebuilding Ukraine. However, multiple studies and surveys also suggest that the majority of these refugees would only return to Ukraine if the hostilities come to an end. And they indicate also that few Ukrainians consider jobs and housing prospects in Europe or Ukraine as the #1 priority when it comes to making the decision to return. It is actually the security situation in Ukraine their priority. But this is also extremely complex, as I think the previous presentation showed. In my view, security is a very elusive notion, considering that some Ukrainian territories have been occupied for years, and Russia will not become a trustworthy party overnight, even if hostilities do come to an end, which is a big if. So it is of the essence, in my view, that the Commission and member states already start thinking about what comes next after temporary protection can no longer be extended. And so I'm very glad that the question has been raised about this. And to just throw some ideas for the discussion, in my mind, there are two options. The first is that Ukrainians apply for international protection for refugee status. But these would entail enormous administrative costs. And going back to the beginning of my presentation, it would probably be very unsustainable for European asylum systems, which are struggling with arrivals from other countries too. Another option, and with this I want to conclude, would be to guarantee them long-term resident status. But for this to be both a realistic option and a common European effort, there should be a targeted amendment to the proposed recast long-term residence directive. And to answer to some of the questions that have been raised, particularly around dual intent, the implementation of a recast directive on new basis would not only give certainty of status after the expiration of the TPD, it would facilitate intra-EU mobility in continuity with the current situation, and it would also allow cross-border mobility from Ukraine to Europe and vice versa in a much, much easier way. So to conclude, either way, I think that transitioning from one status to another will entail challenges, both political challenges, policy challenges, and operational challenges. But it's in everyone's interest that the EU starts developing a longer-term strategy for a post-TPD scenario, while at the same time also helping to devise a plan for Ukraine's reconstruction, which is not contingent on the return of everyone who currently lives in Europe. And I will leave it to this.
Thank you, Alberto. Indeed, you took the opportunity to actually answer a question that I was preparing to ask you about this, about the future scenarios. Now, we have more or less 10 minutes for a brief discussion. I would like to give the floor back to Jean-Christophe to take a minute or so react to some of your comments or questions that you raised, and also maybe sneak in one of my own questions to him. I was interested to learn more about the cooperation, formal cooperation between OECD and the Ukrainian authorities on these matters, and how do they go, and whether their perspective is taken into account in your program and actions, please.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, thank you to the three speakers who have raised very important points, all of them, and just to rebound a little bit to what Alberto was saying in terms of the phasing out of the next steps after the TPD. I think it's there might be some additional options. I think the one you consider on long-term residence directive would have many advantages, but would probably be difficult to negotiate at this stage, unfortunately. I think also that in a way this question is not only for the future, it's also a question for now. Because we've seen in some cases people with temporary protection having difficulties to find durable employment, taking into account the uncertainty about the duration of a permit. So the real question is the extent to which, you know, the status lock them in certain type of employment where the employers don't necessarily cannot make a huge investment on their skills development, and certainly at skill level which are not up to their initial level of qualification. So some countries have been considering offering other residence permit and work permit, but then obviously the issue of the dual legal framework under which these people may be still beneficiary of temporary protection and with a different title, you know, is also something that can be addressed. So I put that on the table because I think it's necessary to think about the next steps, but it's also an immediate question in a way that needs to be addressed now. I want to rebound on another point which was mentioned by Jasmine and also by Jadwiga. It's about the uncertainty, and I think this is really the most tricky question here. I think that countries are much better prepared for this winter period than they have been in any other crisis, but yet we don't know. If we talk about 2 million people coming to the EU, as one of you was potentially saying, based on, I think, WHO reports, it's a big number, and I don't think that the capacity is there to accommodate an additional 2 million people in the very short term. So uncertainty is a big issue, and also from the integration perspective, but maybe also from another perspective that we haven't really mentioned here, and I think is key, which is the uncertainty about the support in the public opinion in host country. As we all said, that has been outstanding, and we can applaud people for all their efforts at the regional, individual level, etc. But you know, with a change in the economic condition, increase in prices all over Europe, probably more or less favorable labor market, whether this public support will remain. Also, the cost of reception of Ukrainian refugees is quite high. We have estimated up to 27 billion for the EU for 2022 only, not counting the other support that the EU is providing to Ukraine. So there is a risk here. how can we anticipate this risk? How can we mitigate this risk? This is, I think, also a big question. And so the uncertainty is not only about the numbers or we're going to stay or come back, but it's also about how can we maintain this support. And I think there is a serious risk here.
Thank you, Jean-Christophe. Yes, the public attitudes is also one of the points I wanted to raise also to the other speakers. We have seen tremendous support at the beginning, and we still have that. But there are worries that this may not hold for long, so that we need to put in place policies quickly and measures so that we have it covered. Now, I would maybe give back to Yasmin the floor to ask her how does she see, do you see how can we tackle this issue of uncertainty, and also how do you explain this variation at the national level of these policies? If you have, I think you've researched in migration and health. So is this an issue of uncertainty with regard to migration profile? Indeed, for example, if there are mothers with small children, then you don't have, you assume that they don't need the quick labor, or is it a matter of how the national policies are structured before this crisis has appeared? So if you have any thoughts on these variations, and where can we actually intervene to make them better, please?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think there's a variety of reasons for these differences. So first of all, the Temporary Protection Directive doesn't have very clear instructions on how exactly it must be implemented. So it provides certain guidelines, but then there's a lot of measures that can be taken in addition to that. And how it is implemented, of course, looks differently across different member states. I think we were coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. Even though it seems sometimes like that's far in the past, that's still also ongoing, and it has left many of our systems overstretched. The healthcare systems, we've seen already enduring housing shortages. This is a point that's been made very clearly also in the OECD report. In education, we see an aging teacher population. So we see a lot of struggles already in place. It was a very difficult context. So that's one part. Then every system or social welfare system is very different across every EU member state, and how you get access to those systems depends very much on your legal status. So I think this also connects to, I think, some of the previous suggestions, how to transition maybe from a temporary protective status to another status, which may also help guide displaced people from Ukraine towards and provide them with access to more mainstream services instead of being rooted into more exceptional measures because of their specific status that they have. So there's a variety of reasons. And then, of course, sometimes there's also the cost. And I think there was also a great analysis in the OECD report of the costs associated with welcoming those from Ukraine. So providing universal access to healthcare is a costly exercise, of course, but also at the same time crucial. And I wanted to pick up on this point from Alberto, that all these issues are related. If you are not healthy, you cannot work. If your children are not in school or at home taking online classes, you need daycare, or you cannot go out of the house to work. So there's a lot. All these different aspects are contingent upon each other. I think, yeah, it's a complex issue, but I do think it provides us with a interesting testing ground to compare these different measures across countries, see how they play out and impact integration outcomes, and learn from this, and also to ask countries to look across borders and learn what is happening elsewhere and see what they can learn from these other measures. And I think from the previous discussion, also to pick up on that, the first step is legal status, right? Your status impacts your access to different services, and also gives you security and that you can stay more long-term in a certain place. And this, again, always affects both the supply side and demand side. We just heard the example of employments, that employers are not maybe as willing to long-term hire someone with temporary protection status because it's temporary. That's in the name. So yeah, I think all these issues are connected.
Thank you. I am informed that we can stay a couple of more minutes. So if you bear with me, if you have more thoughts, also feel free to raise your hand and ask a question for the other panelists. I would now come back to Jadwiga, maybe to hear more about the situation on the ground. I understand that you are involved more at the grassroots level. And again, my question about the cooperation with the Ukrainian side, formal or informal, if you can tell us a bit of how did that go in between Poland and Association Ukraine, or if we have any insights on that.
Cooperation is on various levels, and as I said, at the moment already Ukrainians liberalized the imports of electricity generators, and they stress that this is the crucial item of support at the moment. So already European cities and European Commission and individual countries of EU, of G7, etc., are sending these generators and other facilities that tackle the most crucial problem of Ukraine at the moment, the energy system stability. So this is one thing. Second thing is I would stress the impact of this energy system stability on the front, on the course of fights. For the moment, this influence is not direct, but those who are affected by shortages of electricity, severe shortages, are a different kind of suppliers for the army. Food suppliers, different facility suppliers. So this effect can be seen in the coming months. I think that this is also something we have to tackle. And I think we all have to advocate for different forms of help. The one you mentioned, the Ukraine's accession to, I assume that you were speaking about Ukraine's accession to the accession to EU, the candidate status. This is something that motivates Ukraine to multiply its efforts. But at the moment, it's of course, it's the question of quite a distant future. So for the moment, it's help of a defense nature, that air defense systems, first of all, help of an energy supply nature, energy facility nature, and of course, all kinds of humanitarian aid that is necessary.
Thank you. I have another question. Do you have any reactions to this? Please let me know. Raise your hand. But for Alberto, I mean, you started very well talking about the future and the possible solutions at the EU level. So I would like to hear more about your opinion of how did this crisis actually influence, from your perspective and from your research, influence these ongoing efforts to reform the asylum system. I mean, it's a small question, though you can take a couple of seconds to answer, but from your perspective, how do you see this? Is this bolstering these efforts or not? Please.
Yes, indeed. How much time? How many hours do we have left? So, in a minute, I think it does provide very useful lessons. But I think when it comes to how to actually make use of these lessons, that's where we might see limits. I think that when it comes to operational support, operational coordination, the response to arrivals from Ukraine will probably offer in the long term some solutions that could be used in the future too. I'm thinking about, again, coordination mechanisms like the Solidarity Platform that was launched, but also some of the other tools which have been launched recently also in the field of labor inclusion. However, when it comes to policy making, there is where we might not see any movement at all. I do not think that the unity found and which allowed the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive should be taken as a sign that member states will then agree to the package of reforms which is currently on the table. Even though there are very, very useful lessons to be learned also at the policy level, two that I would like to mention is, first of all, that it does matter how people arrive to Europe, and the fact that Ukrainians could travel visa-free made a whole lot of difference in a context where member states instead oftentimes try to make it impossible instead for persons to arrive and seek protection. And the second one actually concerns secondary movements within the EU, which in the context of the arrivals from Ukraine, which were treated very differently from in comparison with how they normally are looked at and addressed through the Dublin framework. But again, I am very, very skeptic that these lessons will be taken on board to then, of course, launch a targeted reform of the European asylum system.
Thank you. Let's be more optimist. Lastly, since I have you all here in such an interesting discussion, I would also want to ask Jean-Christophe back, since you are from an organization that spans beyond the EU, outside the EU bubble, what can you tell us from the experience of the non-EU OECD countries? What could work, and a short insight of how can you learn from the experience of the other side of the organization, the other countries?
Well, as I said, I think the unanimous and very swift response from the EU has also inspired, in that case, some other OECD countries. Canada, which has very strong and historical links with Ukraine, has put in place almost free travel, almost not visa-free, but very, very smooth facilitation for Ukrainians to come to Canada. I think the mobilization of the host community, of the general public, has also been really outstanding, and this is coming after several waves of big waves of resettlement from Syria, yes, obviously, but after that from Afghanistan, and more recently, so from Ukraine. So I think this is really interesting. I mean, it was also very interesting to see that Japan, for example, the Prime Minister came to Poland and just went back to Japan with some people in his plane and basically sending the signal that Japan stands ready to also host a number of Ukrainian refugees. A country which is not necessarily in the top list of resettlement and refugee hosting across the OECD. So I think this is really a major and collective response. I mean, access, as I said, to labor market, education, basic healthcare has been provided everywhere. I mean, the question is obviously when you go to Canada or to US, I mean, the likelihood that these movements are temporary is very, very small. I think if people were settled in the US or in Canada, they're most likely going to stay there for good. And so if we're talking about such a large number as 1 million people, and this is not necessarily taking into account family reunification because maybe the husbands are still in Ukraine. These are starting to be big numbers only for these countries. So yeah, I think it's difficult to say more, but I think the response of OECD countries has also been outstanding and should be praised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are fashionably late, 10 minutes. That's great. But I think we have an excellent discussion, and I would be looking forward to continue this with other opportunities. So thank you very much for this excellent panel. I will use this opportunity to announce that we have another event, EPRS event tomorrow at 1:30. It's about 45 years of EU-ASEAN dialogue relations. So for the audience, this is the bookmark in your agendas. But for the rest, again, thank you. And we will see each other in other opportunities, and have a good afternoon.